Hi everyone, I'm going to be in my apartment hallway. Audience members are going to be my plants. Again, camera's going to be right here, and another plant. Take a minute to think about your loved ones. They probably went through a public school system of some sort. Now imagine sending them to that same school, knowing that thousands of people have died from COVID-19 in the US. About 155,000 people to be exact. And that number comes from the New York Times. Like I mentioned before, you probably have a loved one that has attended a public school, and you most likely know the fear of returning to school in the middle of a pandemic. Now imagine how your life might change if you contracted COVID or a loved one of yours did. Would you keep them from going back to school, knowing all of the risks? It is my strong belief that K-12 schools should not open their campuses in the fall because it would lead to an increase in numbers of cases in every single state and include potential deaths. Now I'm going to be discussing the reopening of campuses and how that would be detrimental to our country's health. And then I'm going to compare that to what would happen and what that would look like if we were to keep all public school campuses closed. We've got a lot of ground to cover right now, so let's dive into it. First, I'm going to discuss what would happen to the health of the US if school campuses were to open in the fall. Now, it's common knowledge that kids are relatively dirty, and now my question to pose to you all is how can you possibly expect children to follow proper sanitation guidelines and rules? Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love and adore the kids in my life, but they are extremely dirty and they don't know how to properly wash their hands and follow social distancing orders. Their germs would spread like wildfire, and it would exponentially increase the number of cases in every single state. Now, although the mortality rate of children with COVID-19 is relatively rare, it would greatly increase the number or the rate of infection among older adults. A kid coughs on a kid at school, and that kid takes home those germs to their home. If that kid coughs on multiple kids throughout the day and doesn't wash his hands, then those germs are going to multiple homes as well. And then if the schools were to reopen, they would not have the proper funding in place in order for the schools to supply the necessary sanitation equipment like hand sanitizer, disposable masks, and cleaning supplies. We cannot expect teachers to pay for all of these supplies out of their own pockets, on top of all of the other school supplies they're buying for their classrooms. In San Antonio, teachers state that they lack the proper testing and contact tracing infrastructure to support them even with the most limited reopening plans. And that comes from Salinas in my bibliography. It would also be extremely hard for teachers to keep track of every child not following proper sanitation procedure, on top of caring for an already big class. So now let's look on the brighter side of things and compare my first points to how life might look like if we decide to keep public schools closed. If schools were to stay closed and continue on with remote learning, our country would be much healthier, and we would see a decrease in cases in every single state. Like I was mentioning before, it's common knowledge that kids are very dirty and it's hard for them to follow proper sanitation guidelines. And if they continue to stay home, quarantine, and learn remotely, it would not only keep COVID cases at bay, but cases would decrease exponentially. Even if kids are not following proper sanitation procedures, at least they would be at home and not infecting other surfaces that other people touch. We would be able to contain the virus and the number of cases in each state. With schools staying closed, the rate of infection in the population would stay leveled and hopefully decrease in the future if we continue to quarantine and stay socially distant. A study published last week in the Journal of the American Medical Association showed that closing schools in March led to a very steep decline in COVID-19 cases and deaths. And this is from Aaron Gutman in my bibliography. And if the school closures led to a decrease in cases, that points to signs that we should probably stay closed in order to control the rate of infection and the number of possible deaths. Now, if the school campuses were to stay closed during the pandemic, teachers would not have to supply the necessary sanitary products for everyone in their classroom. Teachers would be able to save their money and spend it on their own bills and prepare their classrooms for when the pandemic is over. If the schools are closed, we would save so many adults and educators from being exposed to the virus, and we could potentially save so many adult lives, especially those who are high risk, which is a lot of people. So now we're going to conclude by recapping all of this information that we've covered. We went over how the reopening of school campuses would be detrimental to our country's health. And then we compared that to what would happen if the schools decided to stay closed for the remainder of the pandemic. I stand strongly in my belief that K through 12 schools in the US should stay closed during the pandemic, or else it will lead to a rise in cases in the country. With our country dealing with a pandemic, President Trump wants to postpone the election and ironically thinks it's safe enough to open schools back up. And this comes from Rusinello in my bibliography. And with all of this hypocrisy going on in our country, it's extremely important that we keep all of our neighbors in mind, wear masks, and quarantine ourselves as much as we can, and look out for one another. Thank you.